Hi, and welcome to Part 5 of the Building and Researching Your Family Tree Beginner Series. My name is Hannah, and I'm a reference librarian at the Waco Genealogy Center. And later in this presentation, I'll be joined by Bill Buckner, the supervisor of the Waco Genealogy Center. This program is co-sponsored by the Central Texas Genealogical Society. Today, we'll be talking about alternative sources for vital records. In part 4 of this series, we talked about vital records, which include birth certificates, marriage records, and death certificates. Sometimes those types of records can be challenging to find, and so today's presentation will be all about the alternative sources that you can use to fill in gaps in your research. So what are the values of these records? One, they help confirm that the individual you're viewing is your ancestor. And, like I mentioned, it fills in gaps when there are gaps in the vital records that you're able to access. This also can add supporting documents to your research and help validate information that you're finding. It's also important to use these records to identify potential names for fan research. FAN stands for friends or family, associates, and neighbors. These are all individuals that played an important role in our ancestors' lives. Learning more about these individuals can help you learn more about your ancestors' lives. Names, dates, and places are also important information that you will find on these records, and they help build your timeline for your ancestors, which places your ancestors in context and provides perspective on what their lives were like. As we go through this presentation, we'll be looking for not just what types of records we can access, but where do we find these records. In the bottom right-hand corner, you'll notice an icon that looks like one of these symbols we have here. So we'll be indicating whether these records were found in their physical form, so that's things that were found in books, documents, monuments, whether they came from microfilm found in libraries and archives, or whether they were accessed online through a digital resource such as a database or a website. This is a strategy that we learned from Rebecca Whitman-Cofford, who is the Executive Director of the Board for Certification for Genealogy. So the first type of record we're going to look at is the mortality schedules. This was part of the census that was completed in 1850, 60, 70, and 80, and it was done along with the U.S. federal census. The mortality schedule asks the question, who from this household has died within the last calendar year? And then recorded information about that person's name, age, their sex, their race, their occupation, where they were born, what month they died, and their cause of death. These records are especially important if you're researching enslaved individuals within a family. So for African American research, this might be one of the only documents where someone is named with their full name. Other census schedules in 1850 and 1860 and those earlier did not include the full names. So the mortality schedule is a really important source for that type of information prior to the Civil War. Will and probate records are another common resource to use. A lot of times these records are going to predate death certificates. So before death certificates were required in a given location, you may be able to find a will and probate, especially if your ancestor owned property. These are typically going to be filed at the county level. So the record we're looking at here is for a Mary Jane Patton in Hill County, and here we see that she died on the 9th of January, 1896. So this is about 7 years before death certificates were required in the state of Texas, and here we have an official legal document that's stating her date of death. The other value that you'll get from will and probate records are information about who property was being left to and what type of property this person owned. Here we have an obituary, and obituaries provide lots of helpful biographical details about an individual, and sometimes will give you more information about extended family members. There are lots of different places to access obituaries. This one from the Riesel Ressler was accessed using microfilm. This is a paper that's never been digitized, so it is not available through any of the online sources. And it's also never been indexed by books. The only place to access some papers is on microfilm. But it's also worth searching online databases such as newspapers.com, which you can access free with a Waco-McLennan County Library card through the library website. You can also use resources such as the Portal to Texas History, Chronicling America, and Elefine.com. Many newspapers have also been indexed in print resources that are available at the library as well. Funeral home records are another resource that you can use that may predate death certificates. So the record we're looking at here, for example, comes from Fall and Puckett Funeral Home Records for Waco, Texas, and this individual was only 18 months old at their time of death, and they died February 11th, 1895. So what makes this record particularly valuable is that this individual wouldn't have had a birth or death certificate, and they were not alive during a census year, which means that the only way that we would know that the family had this child is from this type of document. It also gives you information about who paid for the funeral, where they're buried, how much the funeral cost, and a notation of where you can access the original record. Funeral programs are also another great resource. They often include photographs, obituaries, other biographical information, and then clues for further research like the name of the funeral home, the cemetery, and other family members and even church affiliations. You can find funeral service programs with family members, sometimes funeral homes, and even some library collections have access to funeral programs for their local areas. Cemeteries are another great resource for finding information about birth and death dates. Not all cemeteries have been inventoried by websites like findagrave.com. And so sometimes the only way to find information is by going and visiting the cemeteries yourself. Keep in mind that some cemeteries are overgrown, headstones have been damaged, and may not be viewable. So some may require a bit of work, like this one for Martin Sadler, which was initially hidden from view, but was able to be cleaned up and accessed. You can also find records like headstone applications. So Fold 3, which is a genealogy database that you can actually access through our library website with your library card, So Fold 3 has access to veteran headstone applications between 1925 and 1963. Keep in mind that these veteran headstones could have been requested many years after the date of death, and so this individual's death date was in 1921, and this application was filled out in 1931. So keep that in mind as you're evaluating the accuracy of the information on the card. Also keep in mind that these headstone applications do not have birth date information. Here we're looking at a mortuary warrant. This was a type of document that was used in Texas that assisted with funeral expenses for Civil War pensioners who died after 1917. So here we get the place of death and the date of death, and it's certified by the undertaker. These are part of a collection set on Ancestry Library Edition for Alabama, Texas, and Virginia Confederate pensions between 1884 and 1958. Organizational directories are also another place where you can access information about not only organizations that your ancestor was a part of, but when they may have died as well. So here we're looking at the Texas Masonic deaths, and this is a book that we have in our collection here at the library, and it lists individuals with their lodge associations and where that lodge was located. So think about what fraternal organizations your ancestor may have been a part of, as well as what professional associations or clubs that they could have been involved with. Cemeteries also are often affiliated with a church or cemetery association and may have information about the individuals buried there, even when a headstone is no longer visible or present. So this map, for example, provided information about 7 individuals who were buried in this cemetery. This is a church cemetery, but they no longer had headstones. Other types of records that you may be able to find with the Cemetery Association might include information about when individuals were buried, who purchased the plot, what family owns the plot, as well as date of death and possibly even more biographical details.
City directories are just that, directories of individuals from cities, usually mid-sized to larger cities. They were similar to phone books, but predate phone books dating back to the 1880s or earlier. They are published annually. In this case, they're a list of individuals, and in this example, we see the individual, the Phillips widows, with their husbands' names, defining that their husbands are deceased. So this gives you an opportunity to kind of narrow down your focus as to when an individual passed away between the census years. There's great biographical information in city directories. Where they lived, the residence for the H, where they worked, what their occupation might have been, middle names, middle initials, being remarried with a different spouse, volunteer work such as a volunteer fireman, just a great source to track your ancestors between the census. Access-wise, we see a great collection of these in Ancestry. After the 1940 census was released, there was a huge surge in publishing and digitizing city directories across the United States. And Ancestry has done a great job putting together a large collection of these. But also check with your local library because these are very valuable to all kinds of research, and you will want to look at city directories for yourself. This is a pension application, a military record. First for the applicant, and then when the applicant died, the widow would then fill out an application to continue the benefits that were designated by the legislature for those who served in military conflicts. Now, there's great information biographically in these. Typically, you're going to find things like if it's a widow's pension, when the ancestor or military soldier died, when they might have been married, where they lived, what unit the soldier fought with, all kinds of great information, including the claims and the legal information that went back and forth between the applicant and those in charge of approving the application. You will find these on this particular one on Alabama, Texas, Virginia Confederate pensions are available on Ancestry Library Edition. You also want to check though for the National Archive. There's a lot of these pensions that have not been digitized. And so, but another great source to fill in those vital record gaps. So before civil vital records, churches took it upon themselves to create and maintain some kinds of vital records, in this case, marriages. So you always want to look for clues as to the denomination of your ancestor, whether it may be the minister's name and denomination of where they got married, or on a death certificate, who did the funeral. There's other places to look. If you have siblings or children and you're researching those, and say you find that half of them are Catholic, then there's a good chance that maybe your direct ancestor was Catholic. And so always look for information about the denomination of your ancestor. Keep that in mind. And then look at where they lived, and look at, on a map, where the closest churches were of that denomination to your ancestor. This particular record is from Salem Lutheran Church in Washington County, Texas, dating back to 1871. Wouldn't that be a great find, to find your ancestor's marriage listed at that early stage in the records? Now, we've already seen obituaries in the newspapers. Newspapers carry all kinds of great clues. We call them just the gold, that extra thing that we find. In this case, this came from a print source, Georgia newspaper clippings on Talbot County by Tad Evans, covering 1828 to 1906. So just that there was an announcement of the marriage. We find great vital record information. We find who the reverend was, so we could look up that person to find what a denomination. We find the name of the groom, John T. Howard of Columbus, and Miss Martha Ann, daughter of John N. Birch. So we find out her maiden name and her father's name, and just the date of their marriage. It's a great source of information in newspapers. Where do we find newspapers? At your local public library. Libraries have been collecting newspapers from the very get-go. A lot of these have been microfilmed and then eventually digitized. And so there's commercial databases such as newspapers.com. And there's also a site called Chronicling America. And we'll have a segment on newspapers in this series to further dive deeper into what newspapers have to offer. Now, the census, our go-to record to find all kinds of information. Starting in 1850, we start seeing the status of the individual, whether they were single or married. This, in case, is 1910 at the top, and we see the status of single, widowed for W, and then this interesting code of M1 and M2, standing for first marriage and second or supplemental marriage. This is a great source and a surprise to a lot of people to find out that their ancestor may have been married before. This is also a great opportunity when you had large families to see whose children belong to which wife based on the years of marriage next to that M1 or M2. So that's a great source for finding out which children belong to which wife or which mother. Also to determine that there might have been another, by tracing back in time, to find out where they may have been married, in what county, based on the years of marriage. The record below that is 1930, and we don't have the M1 again, but we do have the status and the years of marriage in that record. So always check the census for marriage information. Here in the 1900 census, we also get some vital information about birth. 1900, if you can get your relative there, it's going to list the month and the year of birth. Now, I always compare this month and year to other records, such as a cemetery's tombstone record or a birth record or a death record, to see if I have the right person at the right time, because when those children are born, a lot of times they go by middle names or nicknames, and so sometimes this month and year is off. Sometimes it is similar, and like in this case, Effie Mae Baker, this was her delayed birth record. We see that the month is correct based on her birth record, but the year of birth is different by 3 years. So always take all this into account Now, when you have a conflict, that means you have to resolve that conflict if you're going to continue on and, you know, make the proof of which year they were born. Now, poll list is basically a tax on those that were eligible to vote. It was a tax that was the legislature created, each state legislator. What you're going to find is an alphabetized list of individuals with their name and their county, their age, their race, and sex. So this is a great source to, in between census, to kind of track when an ancestor lived in a county and what year he may have moved by his disappearance from the poll tax list. Poll tax are usually associated or a column within the larger county tax listing. But in this case, this is a Tennessee 1891 statewide listing. In 1870, Tennessee enacted legislature to create this poll tax, but they didn't enact it until 1891. So great source, and this is digitized, it's online through the state archives. So state archives are a great source for finding these poll tax listing. Also, they've been printed by county for a lot of states, and so look for those there. Now, this record is a draft registration. So when our government decided to enact the draft after World War I and World War II, we'll be looking at two examples. So what kind of information could we find in these and what value is it to us? So we have a name, their age, where they lived, the person that is where they're employed, the person that is closest to them, where that person would know how to contact the individual on the registration card. Also, there is a signature there. And so if as you research, you might want to collect the signatures of your ancestor and put them into a timeline. Just helps to identify, did they actually sign the document or did someone else sign it for them? Or is this the right person that you're actually looking for? Even if all the other information is correct, you need to be aware of conflicts and just to make sure you've got everything in order. So in this World War I record, around 1917, it asks for the date of birth as well as the place of birth. And these can be found on Ancestry Library Edition and probably fold 3. World War II draft cards, the same individual that asks for the date of birth and place of birth as well. So this matches, he's a farmer still, but look at that signature. That signature is a little bit different. See how the slant and the J and the R, it's a little bit different. So I would have to mark that as, did he sign this document? Is this something he did, or did his wife fill this out for him? He's also listed as, in the previous World War I record, he listed his address as Personalville in Texas. And in this case, he put the county. So one was more specific and one was the county listing. Family Bibles, the Holy Grail, as you can say. So do you know who in your family owns the family Bible or family Bibles? Family Bibles are typically where you record the life events, birth, death, marriage, divorce, adoption of your family. And you want to look at the entries of those to determine whether it is a primary source, i.e. the ink is a different color, the handwriting might be slightly different for each entry, or it's all in one type of entry. There are collections of Bible records, usually by state archives or historical societies or genealogical societies, in print and online. You also find them under public member trees in Ancestry, where individual family members have graciously put those up for other family members to see. In this case, there's a transcription, there's the original document, and then a transcription. So you want to see that additional information of the Anton Ulrich tells where he was born, his date of birth, when he immigrated to America, that he found God in 1863 in Switzerland. So I'd have to say, why Switzerland? So great source of information if you can find those records, but do look for them. Now, passport applications, historical ones, are similar to those today. This record is found in Ancestry. Ancestry has one of the few collection of passport applications that I've seen, but they have great vital information in them: a place of birth, a birth date of the individual, in this case, the father's name. They're just like today, they were official documents that had to be verified and are a great source to find out where the person may have come from. And if you find one in your family holdings, to see where they have been. So if they've been stamped, people, when they went back and forth, they get their passports stamped, and you might want to, if you had a family one, to see where they may have been going to either vacation or visit other family members overseas. One of my favorites, Scholastic Census. If your family that you're researching had children, you want to look for Scholastic Census, which is basically an enumeration, a census of families with school-aged children. The value of these is you're going to get the names of the children with the parent, and you're going to get dates of birth and ages. This is to help school districts determine how many teachers to hire, what schools they need to build across a county typically. They're typically housed at the state archives of whatever state you're researching. Some of them are online or have been microfilmed. In this case, this is Milam County, and this is from 1899 to 1900. That is quite a few years ago. Wouldn't it be great to find this record of your ancestors? And it's a great source to find in between census. And so these go by period of time, annually, every couple of years. So great, another source to look at between the census. Baptismal records. So prior to civil records and after civil records of government, we find baptismal or christening records. These are primary source records that are close to the event, i.e. the date of birth, and then the child was baptized or christened. And so a great source to, like this first entry here, Henry Joseph Hubert. So he was born 2nd of July of 1905. His baptismal record says he was baptized on the 6th of July, 1905, very close to the time of birth. List his parents and then possibly his godparents, which are typically family or close family friends, part of that fan group. So look for baptismal records when you find the denomination of your ancestor. It's a way to start looking for other kinds of church records that might give you supplemental information.
Let's evaluate where we found the records used in today's presentation. So 9 of these examples came from the physical records, 2 came from microfilm, and 12 were found online in digital records, which means roughly half of these records used in today's presentation weren't found online. So think about that as you're researching your ancestors. If you're only using online databases, you could be missing as much as half or maybe even more of the information out there about your ancestors. So it's important that you utilize all of the resources available to you, be that in libraries, at cemeteries, in archives, in courthouses. Really think about all of the different places that may be holding records for your ancestors. Remember your research strategy. Always ask yourself what other records might exist, and have you completed an exhaustive search for your ancestor? Make sure you're checking all of the resources that may be available to you, and don't limit yourself to online records. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're here to help you. We're located at the West Waco Library and Genealogy Center at 5301 Bosque Boulevard, Suite 275. And you can also call us if you have any questions at 254-750-5945 or send us an email at wmclgenealogycenter@wacotx.gov. Thanks for watching.